Benjamin Netanyahu says he has ordered his cabinet to open direct talks with Lebanon as attacks on the country continued after his announcement.
The European Union has strongly condemned Israel's wave of strikes against Lebanon, saying it's threatening the US-Iran ceasefire. The European Commission has rejected any attempt by Iran or the United States to charge vessels for crossing the Strait of Hormuz. The President of the European Commission plans to raise the issue of Hungary's alleged practice of leaking information to Russia at the highest level of EU's leadership.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said in a statement that he has ordered his cabinet to open direct talks with Lebanon to disarm Hezbollah and establish what he called peace relations between the two countries. He said the announcement comes after repeated calls from the Lebanese government to open direct negotiations with Israel. Israeli attacks on Lebanon continued after the announcement, which comes on the same day that the Israeli military warned residents of Beirut's southern suburbs of imminent strikes and called for them to evacuate. Search efforts are still ongoing in central Beirut after Israel carried out its largest wave of strikes since the start of its war with Hezbollah on Wednesday, killing over 300 people. There has been confusion about whether the ceasefire deal with Iran, which came into force in the early hours of Wednesday, includes Lebanon. Both Netanyahu and US President Donald Trump say it doesn't, contradicting an announcement by the Pakistani Prime Minister, who has been acting as mediator.
The two-week ceasefire deal to pause the war in Iran appears uncertain to hold after Tehran closed the Strait of Hormuz in response to ongoing Israeli attacks on Lebanon. Early on Thursday, US President Donald Trump said that a surge of US warships and troops would remain around Iran until it complied with what he called the real agreement. The latest developments in the war come after the US and Iran both claimed victory after they reached an agreement on Tuesday night, with ongoing violence threatening to scuttle the deal. For its part, the European Union has strongly condemned Israel's wave of strikes against Lebanon.
As European Union, we firmly condemn the recent attacks launched by Israel against Lebanon, which have caused a large number of casualties among the civil population and extensive destruction of civilian infrastructure.
French President Emmanuel Macron condemned the Israeli bombardment in the strongest possible terms, describing them as a direct threat to the sustainability of the ceasefire. Italian Foreign Minister warned of a second Gaza. His Belgian counterpart, who was in Lebanon at the time of the strikes, said the Israeli action was disproportionate. Germany's foreign minister urged Israel to limit itself to the necessary self-defense against Hezbollah and not to go beyond that, a spokesperson said. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez went even further, pointing the finger directly at Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, saying his contempt for human life was intolerable. The barrage of Israeli strikes on Wednesday killed at least 254 people, according to Lebanese authorities. The European Commission has firmly rejected any attempt by Iran or the United States to charge vessels for crossing the Strait of Hormuz, while admitting the final decision on whether to pay a fee is entirely at the discretion of affected companies.
The Strait line and the Strait of Hormuz, like any other maritime lane, is a public good for all humanity. Which means what? Which means that the navigation must be free. Again, freedom of navigation must be ensured. We can turn it in any way that you would appreciate, but again, the law is clear. Freedom of navigation is a public good and needs to be ensured.
The pushback comes after US President Donald Trump stirred concern across Europe by suggesting a joint venture with Tehran to impose a pay-to-pass system on the waterway, which is vital for the transit of oil, gas and fertilizer supplies. On Thursday, confusion continued to reign over Hormuz, with traffic data showing that only a handful of ships had managed to sail through. An estimated 2,000 ships and 20,000 seafarers remain trapped in the Persian Gulf. Ursula von der Leyen plans to raise the issue of Hungary's alleged practice of leaking information to Russia at the highest level of Europe's leadership. 5 European media described how Hungarian Foreign Minister Peter Szijjártó stepped out of an EU summit to call his Russian counterpart to brief him about a high-stakes debate on whether to open accession talks with Ukraine.
And with this, the alleged revelations highlight the alarming possibility of a member state's government coordinating with Russia, thus actively working against the security and the interests of the EU and all its citizens. This is therefore extremely concerning, and it is for the member states' government in question to explain itself as a matter of urgency.
The direct involvement of the President of the European Commission exposes the widespread outrage and unease triggered by Budapest's exceptionally close ties with Moscow, which are increasingly seen as a security threat from within. It was not immediately clear when von der Leyen would raise the sensitive issue, given that Hungarians are heading to the polls on April the 12th in an election where the incumbent Prime Minister Viktor Orbán trails in opinion polls. Hungarian Foreign Minister had not denied the content of the revelations. Instead, he has depicted the cascade of reports as an undercover attempt to meddle in the elections. The revelations come at a time of high tensions between Orbán and his fellow leaders over his decision to veto a 90 billion euros loan to Ukraine at the last stage of the process.
The UK and Norway say they have led an operation to deter Russian submarines suspected of malicious activity in the North Atlantic. Planes and hundreds of personnel monitored a Russian attack sub and 2 spy submarines near undersea infrastructure north of the UK for more than a month, said British Defence Minister John Healey on Tuesday.
And because we were watching them, we wanted to ensure that we could warn them that their covert operation had been exposed and reduce the risk that they may attempt any action that could damage our pipelines or our cables.
Healey issued a warning to Russian leader Vladimir Putin, saying that any attempt to damage the UK's underwater infrastructure will, quote, have serious consequences. British officials have tried to keep Russia in the international spotlight, even as the world's attention is focused on the conflict in the Middle East. They have also stressed the overlap between wars there and in Ukraine, saying Russia has supplied Iran with drone parts and other support.
US President Donald Trump's threats to leave NATO, as well as confrontations with America's European allies over their refusal to join the Iran war, have created the worst crisis NATO has ever faced, former US Ambassador to NATO Ivo Dalder told Euronews.
To continue their protests.
Happened over the last 6 weeks has been extraordinarily damaging to NATO, coming on top of the extraordinarily damaging episode of agreements. And I think the 3 months that have just passed, we will look back at it as the worst crisis that NATO has had in 77 years.
Dalder said Trump's statement suggesting the US might not defend NATO allies against a future Russian military aggression have destabilized the alliance. He added that the 6-week war against Iran has depleted US military resources.
We see a divided NATO, which has been the goal of first the Soviet Union and then Russia for the better part of 80 years. A NATO that is truly at loggerheads, a NATO in which the President of the United States says, I'm not going to defend you, don't count on me, as he put it, or bye-bye, as he said on his press conference on Monday. It's a good time to test NATO if you are sitting in Moscow.
Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte is in Washington, D.C. to try to ease the tensions between the US and its European allies. After decades of construction, the world's first facility for permanently disposing radioactive waste is set to begin operations in Finland. The site is located near 3 of Finland's 5 nuclear reactors. It was chosen for its bedrock known for its high stability and low risk of earthquakes.
The isolation from the civilization and mankind on the surface is important because the radiation caused by the waste. But the thing is that by doing this final disposal, we can dispose of the waste more safely than by storing it on facilities located on the ground surface.
Onkalo can store 6,500 tons of spent nuclear fuel buried deep in tunnels over 400 meters underground, according to the company Posiva. But geologic disposal of nuclear waste is still fraught with uncertainties.
There are still risks. So we have had Chernobyl, we have had Fukushima, and obviously the nuclear waste. We are perhaps somewhere close to a solution for that. Nobody else in the world is anywhere near in solving this problem.
There is currently no permanent underground disposal facility for commercial nuclear waste operational anywhere in the world.